Okay, good afternoon and welcome to Policy Exchange. Very few of you will need any introduction whatsoever to our guest speaker today. Suffice it to say that when I first met Michael, he was not only one of the nicest people in journalism, but also one of the sharpest. And so it was no surprise to me whatsoever that he has had a stellar career since he entered Parliament, first in charge of housing, and now education. Most of you will also know that at Policy Exchange, we've for a long time been very keen on the issues of school choice and new schools. So it's been a great pleasure to work on this project together with Rachel Wolfe and the New Schools Network on our new report out today on both the obstacles to new school creation and also the obstacles to school improvement. I think I would start by paying tribute to Rachel and to Anna and Alex and everybody who's been involved in the project. Particular tribute, I think, is due to our head of education, who has, despite being 5 months pregnant and having a broken ankle, managed to make it to this event today. And I think that it's a measure of the determination that we feel to improve. Now, Michael has made time out of an incredibly busy schedule today to come and be here, so we're going to start with, I think, some words from Michael, and then questions and answers for him, and then we're going to widen out into questions and answers for our two authors here, if that's all right. So it is a great pleasure to be able to welcome back to Policy Exchange our former chairman, Michael Gove. Over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here back at Policy Exchange. I, as some of you may know, was the very first chairman that Policy Exchange had. And when I was the chairman, a guy called Nicholas Bowles, who now is a Conservative Party candidate, was the research director. At that time, we were a tiny band of guerrillas, partisans in the hillside, fighting a lonely campaign. But now, Neil, under your leadership and under Charles Moore's chairmanship, that tiny guerrilla band has turned into the most formidable regular army on the think tank battlefield, carrying all before it. And even though there may be the odd casualty along the way, you are winning arguments, winning friends, and winning new allies in the battle for reform. And can I particularly commend for everyone here, Policy Exchange's not quite latest publication, but the other publications come out in the last 7 days. Their manifesto for the next government of whichever hue, which lays out with admirable clarity and force a set of radical policies, which I commend to you all, and which in the field of education, I think are peerless. While I don't agree with every paragraph, I paid particular attention to one of the paragraphs, which relates to profit making. While I don't agree with every paragraph, the overall philosophical underpinning of what you argue for is, to my mind, unimpeachable. Now, I wrote a speech to deliver this afternoon, and as I was writing it, I was reminded of what Winston Churchill once said when he wrote an interminably long letter. He said, I would have written a shorter letter, but I'm afraid I didn't have the time. And I have laid out the sort of collected thoughts of Chairman, or as it should be in Policy Exchange, ex-Chairman Gove, in a 7,000 word speech, which is available on the Conservative Party website, is contained here before me, and will be distributed amongst those of you who have strong stomachs by my press officer, Henry de Zoet, who is at the back, and who has copies of the full text for anyone who wants to read it. But instead of giving you the full unabridged version, I want to do what talking books do, and I want to provide you with the edited highlights so that you can continue your afternoon in peace and simply concentrate on what for me are the salient points of the argument that I want to make. Because my longer speech and my shorter comments are bound together by one desire. A desire to ensure that everyone who wants to improve our education and our school system recognises the fierce urgency of embracing reform and the critical importance of learning from abroad. In this period, in the run-up to the election, there have been different foreign models that have been admired on the ideological catwalk. And some of those models have come in for criticism. But I want, curiously enough for a party that's been accused of insularity in the past, to stand up for abroad. Because there is a huge amount that our education system can learn from other countries. And there is a huge amount that's been achieved by those reformers on these shores who have been prepared to take off their blinkers and to look abroad. And in particular, I wanted to begin by referencing one set of schools. One set of schools that have had a particular impact on one individual. Those of you who have seen Bill Gates's TED lecture, or who've had the opportunity to read one of his letters on education, or have seen him speak on whichever platform about the great difference that schools make, will find that there is one set of schools that he continually refers back to. They are the KIPP schools, the Knowledge is Power program schools, which are some of America's most successful charter schools, some of the world's most successful state schools. There are 82 of them. They operate in 19 states and in Washington, D.C. The very first KIPP school was started 15 years ago in Texas by two idealistic young men, Mike Feinberg and Dave Levin, who were alumni of Teach for America, the program on which our own Teach First has been modeled. The amazing thing about KIPP schools is that they now educate 21,000 young people across the United States, but they concentrate their energies on the very poorest. They're located in areas of urban deprivation, in Chicago, in New York, in Boston, in Texas, and elsewhere. 90% of their students are African American or Latino. And yet, KIPP exists to prove that poverty need not be destiny. More than 85% of their alumni go on to higher education. KIPP ensures that ghetto kids become college grads. And the reason why is that when you visit any KIPP school, you will discover that a simple, but at the same time exacting set of principles govern how that school operates. Their hours are longer. Pupils are in school from 7:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday to Friday. And then on Saturday, they come back for 4 more hours tuition. Discipline is tougher than in other state schools. Pupils learn to show respect for adult authority. They know that breaking the rules brings instant penalties. And they're also given specific rewards. KIPP dollars for good behavior. Parents have to sign contracts before their children are admitted so that they know the responsibilities they must take on. And in return, teachers are available 24/7. They give out their mobile phone numbers to students and they visit parents at home to help provide support. And at the same time, expectations are higher than in other state schools. There are no excuses for failure, and they proclaim no shortcuts to success. Hard work is encouraged. Classrooms are decked out with posters and pennants from the elite university that the teacher attended, and students are all expected to aspire to go on to a similarly prestigious college. In just 15 years, the period that it takes a child in this country to travel from nursery school to university, tens of thousands of poor children have had their lives transformed by these schools. And now President Obama and his Education Secretary Arne Duncan want to break down the barriers which stand in the way of these schools expanding even more and extending opportunity even further. The story of KIPP is an inspirational story, but it's one that just couldn't happen in this country. Because in this country, under this government, teachers cannot set up their own schools, as Mike Feinberg and Dave Levin did. Almost alone among professionals, teachers can't shape their own destiny. Idealistic lawyers can set up their own practice and choose to champion civil rights or fight for the poorest. Idealistic doctors can choose to set up their practice in our most disadvantaged neighbourhoods and target health inequalities. But idealistic teachers can't establish new state schools, cannot bring wider choice and higher standards to the very poorest areas, and cannot bring the transformation that KIPP has secured to our shores. If anyone wants to know what really needs to change in the British education system, then simply ask them, how can we be content to have an educational system in place which makes it so difficult for schools such as KIPP to be set up, and which places bureaucratic barriers in the way of transformative idealism? Now, the success of KIPP schools and the failure of those in charge of our education system to learn from them goes to the heart of two of the big debates in education. The debate over freedom and standards, and the battle now raging over choice and diversity. KIPP schools succeed by offering an unashamedly traditional model of education. They emphasize discipline, hard work, politeness, respect for authority, parental involvement, a knowledge-based curriculum, a stretching academic offer, and regular testing that all reflects a commitment to rigor and excellence for all, which runs counter to the so-called progressive approach favored by some. KIPP schools are precisely the model that any campaigner for higher standards might hope to emulate. But the higher standards and greater rigor they've generated hasn't come from central government control. It's come from liberating teachers. Relying on centralized bureaucracies in America and in England has allowed those bureaucracies to be captured by the enemies of rigor, the opponents of proper subject disciplines, the advocates of an anti-knowledge and relentlessly relativist approach. In America, it's been only by giving idealistic teachers, such as KIPP's founders, the opportunity to escape from bureaucratic control that greater rigor has been entrenched. And it's only by giving parents, such as those who are beating a path to KIPP's door, the opportunity to choose a school outside bureaucratic control that has guaranteed those parents higher standards. Now, of course, the state has a crucial role to play in helping to foster and encourage the sort of innovation and excellence that schools like those run by KIPP have secured. In America, President Obama is using his office to remove the regulatory obstacles which stand in the way of creating more schools like those run by KIPP, and he is also using his bully pulpit to press the case for higher standards, more stretching curricula, and better teachers. By making it easier for great new schools to be established, by tackling entrenched bureaucratic monopoly power, by affirming the crucial importance of great teachers, and by insisting on more rigorous testing, and by supporting knowledge-based curricula, which stand in comparison with the world's best, President Obama is deploying every weapon that he can to overcome years of educational underperformance and to erase the deep inequalities which scar American society. And I want us to be seen to be following the same approach. Because we have so many of the same problems. In America, there is a passionate and engaged debate about the need to learn from other countries which are making faster educational gains. I want the debate here to become more passionate and more engaged. In America, there is a determination to overcome the legacy of segregation. In Britain, we have one of the most stratified and segregated education systems in the developed world. The gap between the performance of our fee-paying schools and our state schools is greater in England than in any other OECD country. As I'm sure you're aware, the particular problems that we have with our very poorest children are striking, and strikingly worse than any of our competitors. Of the 80,000 children in the last year for which we have figures who took free school meals, between 12 and 13% of the total cohort, only 45 went on to Oxford. It's a massive waste of talent, a scar on our consciences, and something that we are pledged to overturn. And that is why we are so anxious to learn from the model of the KIPP schools that have succeeded in America, and also from all those new schools in America, in Sweden, and in Canada, which have helped raise standards. Because KIPP schools aren't unique. Rachel, in the months since she has set up the New Schools Network, has done education in this country a tremendous service by drawing to our attention the huge weight of academic evidence that points to the dramatic effects that new schools can have on raising educational standards for all. The most comprehensive study ever done on the American equivalent of free schools here in Sweden, charter schools, by Caroline Oxby at Stanford University, found that charter schools produced an improvement in results which was hugely statistically significant. Pupils who enter charter schools at the age of 8 will, by the time they are 14, score 30 points more highly on maths tests than similar children who applied for that charter school but did not get in. And the longer that pupils are in charter schools, the better they do. A student who attends a charter school is 7% more likely to get a high school diploma for every year that they're in the charter school. 3 years in a charter school means that a student is 21% more likely to get a diploma than if they had attended a different state school. Charter schools are overwhelmingly targeted on the poorest. They overwhelmingly help children from ethnic minority backgrounds, and in some cases, like those which operate in Harlem, in the Harlem Children's Zone, they have been responsible for completely eliminating the difference in educational performance which has existed in New York hitherto between black children and white children. And what's happened in New York, observed by Caroline Oxby, what's happened in Harlem, observed by Professor Roland Fryer, has happened in Boston, as observed by Josh Angrist from MIT, and has happened in Chicago, as observed by Jonah Rockoff of Columbia Business School. In all of these jurisdictions, all of these academics have come to the same conclusion. Creating diversity in the state system, generating competition, drives up standards for the children in these schools and has a beneficial halo effect on other schools as well. And as it goes in America, so it goes in Sweden. Several studies have found that an increase in the number of children attending free schools in Sweden, similar to charter schools in America, has improved performance across the board. A study by Anders Bollmark and Mikael Lindahl of Stockholm University found that an increase in the percentage of free schools in any municipal area increased pupil performance in all schools. After Arlen of Uppsala University found that a 10% increase in the number of children attending free schools led to a 5% increase in mathematics performance across the whole area. Similarly, Sweden's Ofsted, the National Agency for Education, has found that municipalities with larger proportions of pupils in independent schools were more likely to say that the presence of independent schools in their jurisdiction had contributed to school improvement in all schools in their municipalities. 91% of parents whose children attend free schools are happy with the schools that they have, compared to just 2/3 of parents in other state schools. And the Swedish National Agency for Education has found that more than 90% of parents think that they and their children should have freedom and the choice which these reforms have ushered in. Now, some observers have argued that in Sweden there is concern about the country's recent record in educational league tables. And quite right too. Unlike here, where ministers are in denial about this country's performance in PISA league tables, there is an open debate in Sweden about what more needs to be done to improve education. And that debate should be put in context. Sweden still does consistently better than England in maths and in literacy. Any check in Sweden's progress in these areas has been much less than in England, and all the evidence suggests that far from free schools acting as a drag on Sweden's performance, their lessons need to be applied more widely. As the editor of the Times Educational Supplement, increasingly a wise voice on these matters, pointed out, there is no evidence that Sweden's free schools have harmed performance. In fact, they are highly popular with parents and staff, which explains why none of the country's main political parties want to turn the clock back. And indeed, when I was talking to Swedish officials last week, they pointed out to me that the real problem that they had was getting local authority schools to be more responsive to the competition from free schools. So the path that they were now resolved to go down in Sweden involved allowing even greater school autonomy over organisation. At the same time, they explicitly said that they wanted to develop a more rigorous knowledge-based curriculum and more rigorous externally marked tests. Just the prescription that we have been advocating here and that President Obama has been endorsing in the US. I've mentioned America, I've mentioned Sweden. They're the two models, the two poster girls that are often cited when people are arguing for school choice. And it's understandable why, when the evidence is so overwhelming. But there are other countries that I want to mention as well. Take Singapore and Finland, two of the best performing nations in any international league table. Fenton Whelan has pointed out in his groundbreaking study of educational excellence, Lessons Learned, that in Singapore, where the emphasis on higher educational standards permeates everything the government does, individual schools have substantial autonomy to plan their own teaching and learning and manage their own resources. At least 10% of state schools have been designated fully autonomous and independent in order to generate innovation and competition to drive up standards. In Finland, as Andrew Adonis pointed out in 2007, a country that many people think of as the pure version of a uniform community comprehensive model is in fact no such thing. In Helsinki, parents of half the children entering secondary schools request a school other than the one originally allocated to them. At the upper secondary level, beyond the age of 16, there is wider choice still, with schools and vocational colleges competing strongly on the range and quality of their courses. Helsinki's 200 secondary schools and colleges increasingly offer specialist teaching in particular subjects, and every family in Helsinki with a child embarking on secondary education receives a prospectus containing information about all of the city's schools. It is a school choice model that is helping keep Finland at the top of the league tables. And the benefits of school choice, which Finnish parents enjoy, have also played a part in another underappreciated education success story, the performance of the Canadian province of Alberta. In the Albertan capital, Edmonton, a quarter of the school population falls under the poverty line, and there are 6,000 Aboriginal students. But Alberta still secures the best performance of any English-speaking jurisdiction in the educational league tables. The superintendent of schools in Edmonton, who's achieved this record-breaking performance, is a wonderful guy called Angus Macbeth, and I just want to quote from him. He says, "Every spring in Edmonton, every kid gets a passport. Their parents and the children go shopping for a school, and schools compete and demonstrate what they're willing to do. They put their achievement results out publicly, and they demonstrate how well kids learn. Parents and children make the choices, and this innovation doesn't cost a nickel." People said initially that parents would be too stupid to make decisions about which school their children should attend. It would be much harder organising busing routes. It would be much harder organising the planning for building if we didn't know how many kids were going to be in every school in any given year. Well, we've been doing that for 32 years, and we haven't shut down yet. But once you let that word out, be prepared for parents to raise their expectations about the kind of service they will receive from the system. Because once people believe there's even a faint hope of choice, that will change things. Bear in mind, as a result of that choice revolution, Alberta now has the best educational system of any English-speaking jurisdiction in the world. Now, the lesson that I draw from all of these international comparisons is a lesson that actually you don't need to go abroad to learn. If you look at the phenomenal success of the city technology colleges, all of them comprehensive schools, all of them independent from local and central bureaucracy, over the last 20 years. If you look at the specific success of academy schools in the last 5, if you look at the concrete achievements of those academies that have taken advantage of the greatest degree of independence from central and local government, the same message is reinforced. If we allow new entrants into state education, if we allow greater diversity of supply, if we allow greater parental choice, we unleash one of the most profound, one of the most far-reaching, and one of the most beneficial forces driving up educational standards across the globe. I mentioned Rachel's research earlier. Rachel's organisation, the New Schools Network, isn't just a fantastic think tank. It's a do tank as well. It is bringing together parents and bringing together teachers in order to create a new generation of smaller schools with smaller class sizes, which will give parents exactly what they want, the sort of education that currently only the rich can afford. In order for the dream that Rachel has outlined to be real, we need a government prepared to make real changes in a whole range of areas. And that's where Anna and Neil's work has been so fantastic. They have spotlighted a huge range of areas, from planning law to school financing, all of which need to change if we're to have the sort of educational revolution that other countries have enjoyed. I found their arguments compelling, I found their radicals embracing, but above all, I felt that their passion, their idealism, and their sense of urgency are just what we need to inject into the education debate now. That's why I'm so grateful to them, so grateful to you, and so grateful to all those educational innovators across the globe who show us what can be done if only we trust parents and trust teachers to do the right thing. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Point and hope you don't break into fights if you want to ask questions at the same time. So, first question.
Yeah, I'm Tim Emmett from the CFBT. I'm very interested in your tour with d'horizon of what's happening around the world. But what exactly are you going to do here? I mean, I'm still unclear on the real mechanisms you're going to introduce that will genuinely liberate the market. So organisations like mine actually come on down and set up schools. How are you going to do that?
Well, thank you. As I said, I wrote a long speech because I didn't have time to write a short one. But the details of what we want to do have been outlined in not just the speech that I've given today, but in the speech that I gave to another slightly less distinguished think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies, a little while ago. Specifically, forgive me for those people here who can be wearied by detail. What we're going to do is, first of all, make it easier for new schools to be set up by changing the planning laws. So we're going to allow any building to be converted into a school under permitted development rights, which relinquishes the need to go through a protracted planning process. We're going to ensure that the supply of land on which you can build a school increases by making sure that D1 land, the land that is zoned for school building at the moment, cannot be used for any other purpose without the Secretary of State for Education allowing it to be used in that way. We're going to change the building regulations for schools, BB 98 and BB 99, so that many of the restrictive rules that exist at the moment, classroom size and the shape of buildings, changes as well. We're going to remove the veto that local authorities have on the creation of academy schools. That means that all existing schools that want academy status and can put forward a decent business plan will have the freedom to acquire that academy status and the money that's currently spent by local authorities. It means that if CFBT, CERCO or anyone else wants to set up a new school, that we will allow you, as charter schools, as KIPP, as free schools in Sweden have done, to set up, to advertise, to attract students, and for every student that you attract, you will receive the full per capita sum which the local authority would have received for that child, much as academies are currently financed through the General Academies grant. We will give you freedom over the curriculum, You will be inspected by Ofsted, but under a different type of format from the way in which Ofsted operates at the moment, because we will narrow the focus that Ofsted has so it concentrates exclusively on teaching and learning, the quality of leadership, the quality of pupil safety, and the quality of pupil attainment, and that the other things for which it inspects aren't things which you need to bother about. We will allow you to negotiate the contracts that you feel that you need with IT suppliers, with managed service providers, and with anyone else who provides the para-educational functions that sustain that school. And we will also have national curriculum tests, but your ability to depart from the national curriculum to disapply it will be such that you can engage in the sort of curriculum innovation which the independent sector and the best academies have already done.
Okay.
Hope that's helpful.
At the back.
I'm Jackie from the National Deaf Children's Society. I have a question. I know that you mentioned poor children. I know that you're aware that children with special educational needs are also underperforming in our schools. Given that the higher number of children with special educational needs are in academies, what are you going to do to ensure that children with special educational needs, in particular those with low incidence needs, such as deafness, are not forgotten about in this removal of regulations and freeing up of our schools?
Well, on a very personal note, I could never forget about deaf children, because my sister was one once, and so if I were to overlook the needs of deaf children and deaf citizens, then my sister, every time I go home, would be very effective in reminding me. But critically, I think one of the impressive things about the way in which many academies have used their curriculum freedoms to depart from the national curriculum is the way in which they have tailored the offer, particularly in Year 7, to children who do have special educational needs, and have helped them get up to the level of literacy and numeracy that they require, which their cognitive abilities would expect them to be able to enjoy, but which they haven't had because they've been in a mainstream setting in primary school without appropriate and tailored support. So I think that's the first thing that's critical. I think with low incidence needs like deafness, one of the things that we need to do is, in major cities, to have centres of excellence. One of the things I do recognise is that our skill in integrating deaf children into mainstream settings has got advanced in leaps and bounds since my sister was at a specialist school for the deaf in Scotland. But at the same time, even though it is now easier to integrate, there are certain things that you need to get right. It's helpful to have a battered teacher. It's helpful to have a concentration of children who have hearing or other difficulties in one school so that battered teachers can be deployed more effectively. It's also helpful to have the right sorts of acoustics so that children can learn appropriately in the classroom. One of the concerns that I have is that a focus on acoustics and a focus on building that helps children learn has been overshadowed by a focus in the Building Schools for the Future programme on meeting all sorts of criteria which are nothing to do with improving the educational experience.
Patrick Watson from the Treasury Public Affairs. When you say freedom over the curriculum, what do you actually mean? I think politicians are predisposed to interfere with the curriculum and want to power.
I quite understand that. When I was recently reading a book, I haven't finished it yet, called Take Care, Mr. Baker, which contained all the arguments that were put forward at the time of the Great Education Reform Bill of 1988. And it's amazing that all the arguments that were made against Ken Baker's reforms are arguments that I'm hearing now. Every single one of them. All the arguments about creating CTCs were arguments that are now being deployed about free schools. All the arguments about curriculum reform were the arguments that were deployed at the time. And there was a tension that was insisted on at the time as unbridgeable between Ken Baker's desire to have a national curriculum and greater school autonomy. And he made it clear that while the national curriculum should be followed by the majority of maintained schools, at that time CTCs need only have regard to the national curriculum. And once the national curriculum was established and examinations took account of it, independent schools, of course, adapted as well. Some of them offered exams which sprang from the national curriculum, others chose to diversify. So once a national curriculum exists as a benchmark, some schools are bound to it by law, other schools have freedom to depart from it. My view is that the current national curriculum is flawed, however many schools are obliged to follow it, because it is insufficiently clear about what children should know and far too prescriptive about how children should be taught. And policy exchange and reform and the CPS and other think tanks have done some great work in pointing that out. So the aim is to have a knowledge-based curriculum which makes it clear to parents, to teachers and to students the level of accomplishment that they should expect to have by a particular age. And that should be benchmarked to international standards, so that it should be age appropriate, so that we know that the level of mathematical reasoning our 11-year-olds have is comparable to those in Singapore. Having established that as a benchmark, it should then be the case that schools have the freedom to disapply the national curriculum as they do at the moment. Of course, that national curriculum will continue to exist as a benchmark. Those schools that choose to depart from it will have to justify that decision to their parents. There will still be national curriculum tests at primary level, and of course GCSEs will still inevitably be modelled on what's in the national curriculum. But if a school has a genuinely innovative way of operating, and if a school wants to offer a different set of qualifications or exam structures, it should not be inhibited from doing so if it is a school of choice, or a school that has strong leadership and has earned the right to buy. And that's exactly the arguments that Ken was making in the 1980s, and which I believe apply powerfully now.
Okay, we've only got time for one more question, because one has to leave. Manu.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Gareth Lyons, Specialist Schools and Academies Trust. One of the criticisms which has been levelled at the school reform is that the schools that the pupils move from will lose resources as a result of this, and that over time those schools will wither away and die, and that the schools who are still, the students who are still in those schools will suffer as a result. What's your response to that criticism?
Okay. I'm praying to name Ken Baker, one of my heroes. Let me pray in another one of my heroes. A hero with feet of clay, but a hero nonetheless. Tony Blair. The critical thing that Tony Blair, critical argument that he took on was a variant of your arguments. Your argument is a sophisticated version of it. The crude version of it was John Prescott's version of it, when he said, look, we can't have all these good new schools. If you've got a good new school, then everyone will want to go there. The critical argument that you're making is the argument that we've got a crap school at the moment, but it's just about on the edge of viability if we shove children into it. Just imagine what would happen if we allowed children to escape. Well, we have that situation at the moment on the ground in a place like Grimsby, where we have a great new school, Havelock Academy, founded by David Ross, another hero of mine. There are children who desperately want to move from other local comprehensives into Havelock to have a higher standard of education. They're prevented from doing so. Their education is being blighted at the moment. And the local authority isn't facing any pressure to do anything about it, because it can keep its pupil numbers up, surplus places down, but in so doing, it's keeping children in a state of ignorance, which will condemn them for the rest of their lives to poorer life chances. I mentioned Alberta. In the longer version of the speech, I quote from Angus Macbeth. Angus Macbeth makes the point that as a result of the school choice model in Alberta, what's happened to those weaker schools is not that they passively wait while they face the problems that you allude to. They are compelled to act. He, as the superintendent, was compelled to say, why is this principal underperforming? Why are parents unhappy? What are you doing to change? And one of the things that we've said is that in the case of the very weaker schools, those that have been in special measures for more than a year, we will act. The decisive hand of the central state will intervene to take the schools out of the hands of people who've been mismanaging them and hand them over to organisations, whether it's the FBT or SERCO or whatever, who have a track record of educational excellence. So it's only by putting the squeeze on those schools which are underperforming and which are letting children down that we can rescue those children. And yes, a greater degree of choice and competition and autonomy allows us to see more clearly those schools that are failing. But while I'm a strong believer in choice and competition and diversity and greater autonomy and professional freedom, I'm also a believer that the state has a role, and that when children are really losing out, then it's our moral responsibility to intervene dramatically in order to provide them with a higher quality of education. I'm conscious that I should go, but I'm also conscious that people may have one or two other questions that they want to ask. So I don't know, Rachel, if you wanted to take two or three in a bunch.
Yeah, so one from Elaine, one from another client, and one from another client. Sorry, Elaine.
Right, thank you. Elaine Simpson from SERCO. One of the, what I wanted to ask really, and it relates I think to the last question, was around how the regulatory aspects of this will work. We were privileged last week to, or the week before last, I forget when it was, to hear the speaker from the charter school movement, who said very clearly something that many of us who've tried to close schools know well, and that is that schools won't automatically wither on the vine and close just because they're not very good. Because actually parents, and you know, many of us in this room will have gone through that, parents will rise up and march to keep the school, albeit an appalling school, rather than admit, an awful thing to say, that they've made a mistake in their choice for their children. So they'll defend it, and the person from the charter school movement talked about the challenge that had presented to them in New York. And I wondered what sort of regulatory approach you were considering that might enable those schools to then go into a sort of receivership system if necessary.
I'll answer that, but I'll take the other two as well.
Lisa says on from the Age Foundation. Michael, taking on, following on from your observations about future curriculum and freedom, how do you foresee the future for performance schools?
And Francis Beckett.
So, I'm Francis Beckett, I'm a journalist. Some of my friends tend to accuse you of wanting to privatise them. It seems to me, having heard you, that they're entirely wrong. What you want to do is to nationalise. Because what you're doing, as you made quite clear, is to take away the power of local authorities to decide which of these private sector organisations can come in and found schools. But you're not actually proposing to abolish that power. At least I assume you're not proposing to abolish that power. That power, in fact, ends up with central government. So what you're actually doing is taking the power out of the hands of local people and taking it into the hands of the Secretary of State.
Three very good questions. I'll deal with Francis's first. I'll mention another one of my heroes, Teddy Roosevelt. One of the reasons why Teddy Roosevelt was a politician of the right, even though he always thought of himself as a progressive, is that he recognised that the greatest threat to freedom was always monopoly power. That's why he was a trust buster, and he broke up Standard Oil, and he did many of the wonderful things he did at the turn of the last century in America. And it's because monopoly power, whenever it's exercised, even by the beneficent, always tends to lower standards and to diminish choice and to rob professionals of autonomy, that I'm against it. And what I want to do is to ensure that bureaucratic monopoly power is challenged as well. So if you have one person who's the sole provider of education in a geographical area, London, Leicestershire, Liverpool, then you do not have that opportunity for innovation and challenge and competition, which has brought the benefits that I've advertised here. So my aim is to ensure that you cannot have a local authority acting simultaneously as manager of schools and gatekeeper to education in that area, because that denies real choice. And I think it's also a mistake to imagine that local education authorities genuinely do act in an accountable way. The situation that I described in Grimsby is maintained by the local authority in North East Lincolnshire because they know that they have the power to do so, and as a result, when parents try to vote with their feet, which is a much more potent and responsive way of securing what you want than exercising a single vote in the ballot box every 4 years, they're prevented from doing so. So, yes, it is the case that there are some powers that local authorities would lose, and yes, it is the case that I do see a role for the central state, but I see it as a role which actually empowers communities to have the schools they want, empowers teachers to create the schools that their idealism impels them to, and enables those local authorities that are strong and are doing a good job to argue the case passionately for their schools and to drive improvement because there is a new pressure on them to do so, which I imagine many of the very best will rise to with enthusiasm. On Elaine's point, you're absolutely right, it's a hard case. My own view is that the overwhelming number of parents really do want the best for their children and are alive to the performance of schools and make informed decisions on the basis of the performance of schools. And if you look at the fact that 1 in 6 families across the country don't get their first choice, and when you bear in mind that in so many parts of the country there is no effective choice, in East Durham or wherever, then that sort of gives the lie to the suggestion that parents don't want to exercise it. And the evidence, again, from abroad is that when parents are given that choice, they exercise it. But there will always be the unbudgeable affection of some parents and some communities for schools which are not doing the job they should for the children there. You have to accept that. And that is why you need to have an inspectorate like Ofsted that is totally focused on looking at teaching and learning and the quality of leadership, and that can place schools in a category whereby they can be placed under supervision, and if necessary, whether the schools are run by local authorities or by outside providers, if they are not doing a good job, then we can make sure that appropriate management is put in. So there's a clear role there. And finally, on Nicholas's point about vocational qualifications, several things that I want to say. First, in terms of structural reform, Ken Baker, who is, I think, the new chairman of EDGE, has come up with a visionary idea for taking advantage of school reform and school choice to create a new generation of university technical colleges. 14 to 19 schools, which will explicitly target those children who want a technical, hands-on, practical education. Some of whom may be going on to do university subjects like engineering, others of whom will want to be in the world of work from the age of 19 onwards and will pursue an apprenticeship. And I think that Ken's idea is visionary, it draws from abroad, and it's something that we want to build on. Because critically, one of the striking things about KIPP is that it breaks up some of the patterns that people expect about when children should be in school, at what time. I think one of the things that we should recognise is that in many cases opting to follow a technical education at 14 is worth doing, and that sometimes, as in the private sector, prep schools, which keep children in an intimate environment until the age of 13 or 14, but provide them with rigorous specialist teaching, have something to tell us about combining intimacy at a critical moment in a child's development with rigour. So school choice and flexibility can build on that. Final thing that I would say, we urgently need to improve the quality of vocational qualifications in this country. There's been a lot of energy and passion devoted to the diploma programme. Some of the diplomas, like engineering, I think have a great deal to offer in the future, others a little less so. But many of the best vocational qualifications are those that are designed by employers or professional or craft organisations as licenses to practice. So whether they're on the one level accountants or on the other level the people who design the City and Guilds qualification for plumbers. They, because they confer upon an individual the ability to perform a particular task, are particularly rigorous. In many cases more rigorous than academic qualifications. But what they're testing is practical and applied knowledge rather than theoretical and academic knowledge. And that's what we need to affirm at the heart of vocational education. And critically, we don't generate higher esteem for vocational education by academicising vocational qualifications and adding more theory. We generate esteem for them by making them rigorous tests of practical and applied knowledge. And the people who are best equipped to help us there are those in business and in industry and in the craft tradition, working with people like EDGE who are passionately committed to improving educational opportunities.
Great. Michael, thank you so much for
Not at all.
questions.
Thank you.
Officer is making faces at me.
Sorry, I've got to go. Thank you so much everyone for coming along, and as I say, a fuller and more tedious version of the speech is available on the Conservative Party website. Thank you.
Don't run away.
Thank you everybody. I know that we're all getting very sweaty in here, but just remember that you're not in a cast. It's really much worse. I'm sorry that I've got 2 chairs and some people at the back haven't got any, but if you can bear with us, we'd just like to finish by, we'll do a very quick run through with some of the things that we have pulled out of our report. So policy exchange working with the New Schools Network. Michael's obviously talked a lot about school choice, and the notion of school choice is absolutely not new. We've had endless debates about the advisability of bringing more providers into the system in order to drive up quality and to give parents more control over their children's education. But the reason we did this report is that we've decided that in the heat of all of this debate and in the excitement of political speeches such as the one that we've just heard, what quite often gets forgotten is the practicalities. It's all very well talking about setting up these new schools, but unless we manage to get rid of the current morass of local and national bureaucracies, the fact is that only a handful of new schools will ever be set up. So, with a general election before us, we thought that it might be sensible for somebody to look at the practicalities. We talked in detail to a large number of academy sponsors and to find out where exactly the blockages were happening in the system, what was really frustrating them. And we also talked to people in Sweden and America to learn the pitfalls as well as the best practice. The report is available at the back of the room, so before you leave, if you want to grab a copy, please do so. We covered a lot of different issues, and I'm just going to run through a few of them for time's sake. First of all, local authorities. As many of you will know, in February the government launched a new accreditation process for academies. This means that sponsors are now divided into those who are allowed to run a single school and those who the government is going to allow to run a group of schools. In both cases, it's really very difficult for organisations who aren't already providing education to run academies. This is a radical and hugely unwelcome shift. We should remember that the theory behind the original programme was that those with different experiences and different skill sets would benefit schools which have been failed already by a traditional educational provider, in other words, the local authority. Under the new system, organisations have to show evidence of track record, capacity and educational expertise. As a result, the type of sponsor has moved very sharply from those with business backgrounds to FE colleges, universities, schools and local authorities themselves. At the same time, single sponsors are being replaced by conglomerations of 2 or more groups. The local authority is often one of those sponsors, remaining involved in schools which it has already failed. So Ed Balls has definitely achieved 3 really pretty bad things here. First, he's dramatically reduced the pool of potential providers and reduced our chances of real innovation. Second, he's confirmed the local authority's central role in deciding who should set up schools and what sort of schools they should be. This is really frustrating when we remember that Blair's original vision for academies was a new type of school to deal with local authority failure. Third, the new system judges a provider solely on its history. It isn't interested in its plans for the future. So again, bang goes any chance of innovation or real change in the system. If you manage to get through the approval process, your headaches don't stop there. You're immediately asked to appoint a project management consultant. You're given a nice choice of them by the department. You're not allowed to meet them, ask them any questions, but you're allowed to look at some tick boxes. All of the sponsors that we spoke to felt that this was incredibly expensive. They'd all spent around 500,000 or more on their PMC, but all of them thought that they were low quality. Most of them had also done some of the work that the PMC should have been doing and hadn't received any reduction in the cost. So this is a scandalous waste of resources and cash that could have been better used elsewhere. Michael mentioned planning and building, because when it comes to finding the premises for your school, your headache will fast become a serious migraine and a long one. As we all know, in both Sweden and America, successful and popular schools have sprung up all over the place. They're in office blocks, they're in residential spaces. They might share space with other more traditional schools. And this is because in those countries they understand something that we don't quite get here, which is that good education is not about the building, it's about what happens inside it. Here is a really different story. One academy sponsor spent several years trying to set up a new school. In the end, their architects and construction companies all got together and agreed that yes, it was going to be cheaper to build a brand new school costing tens of millions of pounds than it would be to try to refurbish something existing. This wasn't due to any problem with the building structure or anything like that. It was due to the weight of regulations and planning problems that would be heaped upon trying to carry out a project such as that. This is bonkers. And if we look forward, everybody's aware that we're going to have cuts. I think most people are aware that capital is one area that's definitely going to be squeezed, and we've got to make it easier for people to set up schools in more innovative places, as well as to set up more innovative forms of education. The Big Bang approach, which Michael didn't suggest today, because it's actually politically rather difficult, is to remove planning for schools from local authorities completely. Make sure that all planning for schools immediately, for new schools, immediately goes to the Secretary of State for Education. That would be terribly nice, but it's quite a big nettle to grasp. So in the meantime, there are all sorts of smaller things that you can do, which Michael mentioned, such as trying to make it possible for schools to set up a land that isn't D1, as well as protecting your existing D1 land, and freeing schools, new schools, from ridiculous restrictions on how big their classrooms have got to be and how exactly they've got to use their space. Just a final few words. I've talked a lot about improving the process of setting up a school, and there's a hell of a lot that needs to be done there. But you've also got to think about whether the providers are going to be allowed to run that school when they get into it. We all know that in this country, our default mode is to run schools from Whitehall. And if we're going to achieve something like real independence for these schools, then we've actually got to shift quite a long way. That means we've got to look at curriculum. It was incredibly telling that Ed Ball's first speech, he decided to whip away the total freedom that academies had from the national curriculum. But we've also got to think about things such as the IGCSE. Academies aren't allowed to offer the IGCSE in core subjects. If they want to offer the International Baccalaureate, which universities love, a lot of parents would like them to offer, they have to go to the Secretary of State and ask special permission. Staffing is another issue. We've all heard that academies have got a lovely amount of freedom on pay and conditions, but in fact, if you take over an existing school, you also take over all of the teachers in that school, and very little can change. It's very difficult to find out anything about the staff you're taking over either. The local authority has to tell you, according to European regulations, has to tell you who you're taking on and under what conditions. But it only has to tell you 14 days before your school opens, which is hugely helpful. So that means that you're reliant on your new head, who's hopefully rather brilliant and hopefully extremely good at negotiating and winning people over, to go and chat to the old head and say, wondered if you might be able to let me in, old chap, and just sort of see who's in the school and chat to people and try to get them on board. But it's pretty likely that the head will say, I'm sorry, no, I hate the idea that you're booting me out of a job and you can't come in. So we've got a closed culture that makes it incredibly difficult, even before you've started, to get on top of your staffing problems. Accountability, Michael touched on. Accountability is obviously incredibly important. We don't want a free-for-all. That's a big problem in Sweden. It's a big problem in many states in the US. But as Michael mentioned, the Ofsted process is extremely time-consuming and focuses largely on the wrong things, on non-educational outcomes. It's really rather crazy that, given that Ofsted has limiting judgments on safety and equality, you could have somebody coming along to inspect your school, and you're providing brilliant education for all of your students, but the inspector comes along and nobody asks him at the gate for some identification, and as a result your school will be classed as inadequate. Is that really what we want from an inspection system, and is that really what we mean by accountability? I don't think so. So there are a lot of things that we need to sort out. There are a lot of practicalities that need to be tackled. I hope that you'll take the time to have a flick through the report and see some of our ideas on how we might address them. Unfortunately, we're going to lose Rachel very soon, but I'm hoping that if I put my foot in the way, we might hang on to her for a bit. And if anyone has any questions relating in particular to either barriers to setting up a new school or to barriers to achieving independence within new schools, then we'd be happy to take them just for five minutes or so.
Yeah, hi, Jonathan Simons for the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. Kind of really interested to talk a little bit about this issue about barriers to entry. You talk a lot in sort of the chapter about application, accreditation and implementation. You're very kind of critical of the current process for accrediting schools groups and saying that these barriers to entry are far too high. But then in the chapter on economies of scale, on page 45, you're then also very clear that you want very high barriers to entry and the sort of schools that expand, and you're very explicit that you do want quality judgment. Is your argument, crudely put, that you let anyone in but only if they're good you let them expand. Is that how you reconcile those two?
No, it's two things. First of all, that in judging whether someone should set up a school, the burden of proof should be on what they're proposing to do rather than their previous background. So, for example, the KIPP schools would never have got through this current accreditation process because they wouldn't have had the background to do it. So allowing them to start small because they have a competent plan is crucial, or you're never going to get new providers who might scale. Having come in, it is then important to ask them to demonstrate success before they expand massively. And I think one of the problems in both Sweden and America in some states is they allow them to expand too quickly without demonstrating that success.
And just to add that even the KIPP schools, if you speak to them, they'll say that they were in a massive rush to expand at the beginning and it was a disaster. They had to close down quite a lot of schools that they'd been setting up because they were low quality, so that's an incredibly important issue.
Hi, I'm Paul Chris from the Centre for Research and Evidence Education. I suspect that the stultification of the system, blocking it up through the bureaucracies that have been described in your report in particular, are not ideologically driven by whichever party provides the ministries. It's a reflection of a growing risk aversion in society, and particularly by those people who are in official positions. I wonder whether, if I'm right, you're flying in the face of a big cultural problem which isn't overcome by working on the kind of processes and procedures that requires rather bigger in society.
I mean, I think at one level you're right in that there are a lot of people in the system who are averse to change and averse to risk. But what the system does is allow those people to block change. At the same time, we've been working with hundreds of parents and teachers and other charities who are far from risk averse, who would love to set up new schools, and who, in a system where those blocks don't exist, would do so very quickly. So I agree that there are some cultural issues. What I don't agree with is that you cannot work your way around those cultural issues by not allowing the people who feel against this idea to block new schools. Any more questions?
Joe Garrett, the first question is how do you see new
You only get one. So choose.
No,
you only have one. We're rushing.
How would you see new providers accessing, because you talked about liberalising requirements in terms of buildings that schools go into, but there will still need to be some capital to furnish buildings, even if we're free from building bulletins. How do you propose that new entrants would access that initial capital required to set up the school?
Well, two things. I mean, first of all, it is quite noticeable that in neither Sweden nor America have they received any capital funding, and they've had to do it from savings from their revenue budget, and have still managed to set up a number of new schools. But although this isn't in detail in the report, you can relatively cheaply, by moving to a system where it's much easier to lease and much easier to refurbish rather than buy, have a relatively small capital annual uplift, which is not much risk of expenditure from the Treasury, but can allow providers to set up new schools. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail later, but it's probably a bit complex at the moment.
The current Conservative plans are only to let non-profit making organisations apply to run free schools. How big of a problem do you think that is?
First, I can understand why they're not grasping this one right now. There's quite a lot of emotion around the notion of choice, and I think there are a lot of things to do, and politically this is incredibly sensitive. It's worth remembering that Blair and his advisors saw absolutely no reason why they shouldn't allow providers to make a profit when they were first thinking about academies, but they just decided that this potato was a bit too hot to touch. In the longer term, though, I think that if we're going to achieve serious scale, then profit is a big issue, because a lot of chains who would like to come to this country and people who would like to expand are very much waiting for that to happen. So I don't think there's any particular indication that there's going to be a political change in this direction, but policy exchange would certainly nudge very strongly in this direction.
I only have time for one more question.
Oh, in fact, you've asked one. I'm going to be tough. Anyone else? Any other questions? You can ask a question.
Joe Camping again from the National Electrical Society. My question was back to building regulation. And I was a bit concerned on the recommendation of freeing completely new schools from building regulations, particularly with regards to acoustics in new school buildings. We have seen that the non-application of building regulations in building schools in the future programme has produced schools with very poor acoustics that affects all children, not just their children. So how do we ensure that that sort of those building regulations are there for very good reasons, are still viable?
Yeah, I think you do need to split between certain kinds of building regulations, that's fair. And there are some, such as acoustics and lighting, where particularly in cases where you are not allowing people to have any kind of decision about the sort of schools that they go to, which is still going to be the case for most schools in most of the countries, you do force those minimum standards. I agree that that's important. Most of the building regulations, particularly BB8, 98 and 99, but not exclusively, don't deal with those issues. They deal with the kind of spaces that schools ought to have and the kind of teaching and learning schools ought to have. Most of the most successful charter schools and free schools in Sweden have nothing that resembles that. They're in much smaller conditions, and parents have made the decision that they would rather go to a school which has perhaps poorer facilities but has superb teaching and learning. And without relaxing those requirements, you're not going to see the kind of new great providers that otherwise you might.
Well, I think we're going to end there. Thank you so much for coming along. As I said, the report's available at the back of the room, so do please grab a copy for bedtime reading. And thank you very much.